Hola, it's Beto here, your Daily Divinity Coach, here for episode number 30 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. I'm going to go ahead and tag some folks so we can get an audience going. If you're watching the recorded video, go ahead and fast forward a few minutes. I'm going to tag some folk and give a brief introduction, and then we're going to get into the content of today's episode. So let me go ahead and tag some people here. We'll get an audience going. Perfect. Just seeing who's live right now, who we can tag, and then we'll get going soon here. So just take a few minutes for us to get an audience, and then we'll get going. So really excited about today's episode. Again, this is episode number 30 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. And just tagging some folks so we can get an audience going, and then soon we'll get going here. So just seeing who's available to join us, and we'll get going real soon here. See, there's a few more people we want to tag. Yep, a few more, and then we'll get going shortly. Just seeing who's active on Facebook right now, and then we'll get going with episode 30 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. Oh, just a few more, and then we'll get going real soon here. Okay, I think that's enough. All right, yeah, we got an audience going. Perfect. Awesome. Hello. Can Healy or Veronica or Rick, can you just give me a thumbs up? Let me know you can hear me. Oh, we got some hearts. So, Emmalou. Shout out to Emmalou. So, yes, if you can just let me know, give me a thumbs up. Let me know you can hear. I got audios working. That would be greatly appreciated. So, thumbs up. Perfect. All right. So, just going to give you a brief introduction, then we'll get going into the content of today's episode. So I am Beto. I am your Daily Divinity Coach, and I am here for episode number 30 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. Really excited to be at episode 30. It's like a milestone for me. I said if I can make it to 30, I can make it to 100. So excited about not just this milestone, but about the episode itself, which is entitled Hamilton, Mr. Robot, and Manifesting Immortality's Generational Wealth. Today is Sunday, January 24th, 2021, and if you have any questions about anything, you can always refer to my website. It's dailydivinitycoach.com. So just a brief introduction. I am Beto. I am your Daily Divinity Coach. I am a Master Divinity, actually hold a Master Divinity degree, and I'm a graduate of Harvard University Divinity School. I teach on three main subjects or topics. Number one being the law of attraction. I was tutored in the law of attraction, or still am actually, by my mother. I started at the age of 10. So I talk about the law of attraction, which I also call manifesting abundance. I also talk about liberation theology. So I was introduced to liberation theology in undergrad in college, and actually that was my emphasis of studies in graduate school, in divinity school, seminary. So I also call that manifesting justice or manifesting social justice. And the third main subject or topic that I talk about is, manifesting immortality, which is also anti-aging. So I talk about that as well. And so I make these bracelets. There's a black bracelet, they're rubber bracelets. There's a black one that reads Manifesting Immortality, a blue one that reads Manifesting Abundance, and a gray one that reads Manifesting Justice. And so I make these bracelets and I give them away for free. If you live in the U.S., the shipping is always free. If you live in North America or Europe, until the end of March, shipping is also free. So if you haven't received your bracelets and you're here in the U.S. or in Switzerland or Mexico, Puerto Rico, and wherever, again in North America, Europe, please reach out. IM me, DM me. Happy to send you bracelets. And I was asked recently, Beto, I have family members, parents, cousins, sisters, etc., that are interested in the bracelets too. Can you ship me out, a quantity of more than, one set? Can you ship me out 5 or 10 or whatnot? And so yes, I can do that. So also, if you, a family member or a friend doesn't live near you and they live, a ways away from you, like in another state, and you want me to ship, I just need a name and an address, and then a quantity if you want more than one set. So please reach out. This is like a blessing for me to be able to send these bracelets out. So it's fun. I enjoy it. So yeah. So I'm your daily divinity coach. I'm Beto, and we're here for episode number 30 of my weekly series, a Sunday Weekly Revival. And so we're going to get started with the content now. We're going to talk about Hamilton. So if you've seen Hamilton, it is a smash Broadway play, right? It's a big time play about the life of Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. The Broadway play Hamilton, was nominated for a record 16 Tony Awards. Record 16 Tony Awards, and won 11 of those, including Best Musical and Best Original Score, and this was in 2016. It won other awards too. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and it won the Grammy Award for Best Musical Theater Album. So very decorated Broadway play. Who wrote it? It was written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was born in 1980, and he is New Yorican. He's from New York, of Puerto Rican descent. Like J-Lo, right? Like Jennifer Lopez, like the Honorable Sotomayor, Chief Justice Sotomayor on the Supreme Court. I mentioned those two because on Wednesday, the new president of the United States was the inauguration of Joe Biden, right? And J-Lo performed, and Justice Sotomayor, actually swore in our new vice president, Kamala Harris, from California. So, but anyhow, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote and came up with the music for Hamilton, and he's New Yorican. And he also starred. He also starred in the play too. And what he did is he featured a multiracial cast. So people of color, right, were in Hamilton. And this is what he says about doing that. He says, we're telling the story of old, dead white men, but we're using actors of color. And we're doing this because this is a story of America then, but it's being told by America now, right? And so he made this story relevant, right? So it would resonate with Americans, right? Because we live in a multiracial, multicultural society. And it worked, right? Hamilton, right? The vision of Miranda became a pop culture phenomenon, right? Just in July, this summer, it was released worldwide, right? For streaming on Disney Plus. It just worked how I saw it this summer. Healy actually helped me stream it, and we watched it together. So that was awesome, right? I loved it. I'm appreciative of her because I don't have Disney Plus. I just have Netflix and Amazon. I think a short-term subscription to Hulu. But anyhow, in the play Hamilton, there's a song, and the song is "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? This is a song in the play Hamilton. And I'm just going to take a couple lines from that song. And they're lines that were attributed to Thomas Jefferson, who was the 3rd president of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson says this in the song. I don't think he said it in real life, but he said this in the song. He says, his financial system, so the financial system of Alexander Hamilton, right, the first. And see, Hamilton wasn't just the first Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton was really the architect of the American economic system. So anyway, Jefferson says, his financial system is a work of genius, right? I couldn't undo it if I tried, and I tried, right? What is he talking about? So Hamilton actually proposed the first Bank of the United States, and was signed into law by the first president of the United States, George Washington, in 1791. So the first bank of the U.S. Was Hamilton's idea, and it became a reality in 1791. However, the charter for that first bank was only for 20 years. How did that happen? You see, Thomas Jefferson was against the bank. So he put in that the charter would only, or he was behind this idea that we'd only grant that charter for 20 years and then it would expire. And sure enough, it did. The bank that first bank of the United States only lasted for 20 years. So why was Jefferson against Hamilton's economic system and the first bank of the U.S.? Well, in the Constitution of the United States that was written before the first bank of the U.S., the Constitution had placed a ban on paper money. Only gold and silver money could be used, right? Could be used. And so, and that's why Jefferson was against it. He thought that government control of money leads to tyranny. And Jefferson was, obviously against that. He's against tyranny. That's, why the war was fought, right? To free the U.S. colonies from the British Empire. Was a war against tyranny. Anyway, ultimately, it's Hamilton's legacy that it has persisted, right? This idea of central banking persisted. And it actually gave rise to the Federal Reserve Act of 1911. So we're fast forwarding a lot of years, right? From 1791 to 1911. But it was Hamilton's legacy, his influence, that gave rise to the Federal Reserve Act of 1911. What was the Federal Reserve Act of 1911? The Federal Reserve Act granted legal status to what is really a cartel of the largest bankers and gave them the power to inflate the money supply at will. And the Federal Reserve Act was actually written in secret. So now now it's been written into law, right? 1911. The Federal Reserve is responsible for the boom-bust cycles that transfer wealth from working folk to the rich and powerful. And I talked about this last week in my last Sunday weekly revival, how the rich and powerful have become more, right? They become richer and more powerful during the pandemic, which is actually a bust, right? The economy is going down right now. They become more powerful, right, during these bust cycles, and the middle class or the working class end up losing stride, and then the poor become poor. And we saw this in the 2008 housing crisis and, every economic recession or depression prior. So how does all this work, right? For a lot of people, this is very confusing. It's, how does it work? Well, it's actually not all that confusing. It's not a mystery when you really think about how this works. So what happens is when the money supply is inflated, and it's no longer it's no longer actual print currency. They do it electronically now. But when the money supply is inflated, right? They increase the money supply. The early users, the first people to touch this money supply, is the government, the big bankers, large corporations, and because they touch it first, they are the beneficiaries. Why is this, Beto? Because by the time that new money comes into our hands, right, the hands of working folk, prices have risen. They've gone up, right? Prices have risen. And so the purchasing power of working folk is actually diminished, right? So if you think of the housing crisis that took place in 2008, a little bit before, a little bit after, houses were skyrocket high, right? They're inflated, right? Housing prices were inflated. So then what happened is when the housing prices crashed, who bore the brunt of that? Working folk, right? We're like, oh my God, myself, oh my God, my home is worth less than half of what I paid for, right? Even though I put a huge down payment. I'd saved and saved and saved, just like my grandmother told me to, and I put this huge down payment, but now that's wiped out, my home value is wiped out. I'm like, what the heck just happened? So the the bust happens, right? The boom and then the bust. So then all of a sudden, more money goes out into the system. The people who get it first are the rich and powerful. So then they're able to come and buy, right? They bought my home at a fraction of really the real value, because it eventually, and a couple years later, it went back up. and then they gained on that, right? So that's how it works. It's just, well, Bernie Sanders calls it a rigged system. It really is. I mean, that's, these boom and bust. They win in the booms and they win in the bust, and then working folk obviously lose in the bust, and we just get further and further behind. But anyhow, moving on. I'm now going to fast forward from 1911 to 1971. So we're moving through lots of decades really quick here, centuries. So in 1971, President Nixon eliminated what remained of the gold standard. Okay, so yeah, well, ideally, a nation's currency is tied to gold, right? $1 is worth whatever, 1 ounce of gold. By 1971, there was a very loose gold standard, very, very loose, but there is still somewhat of a gold standard. In 1971, President Nixon eliminated that. So at that point, the US dollar became true fiat currency, meaning it's backed by nothing. No intrinsic value, no inherent value or utility, just, whatever the government wants to say is its value and able to manipulate its value and whatnot. So fast forward 9 years, this is what President Ronald Reagan, right? Not a Democrat, a Republican. This is what he actually said about all this. Ronald Reagan said this. He said, "No great nation that abandoned the gold standard has remained a great nation." Okay? Again, Ronald Reagan said, no great nation that abandoned the gold standard has remained a great nation. He was talking about what Nixon did, right? Who completely took us off any sort of semblance of a gold standard. So if you, reflecting back to last week, I talked about 5 factors that lead to the end of empires, right? Number 1, overreaching militarily. I talked about Afghanistan, also known as the graveyard of empires, right? And how the U.S. is now in its longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan. Also talked about mistreatment of those at the center, or treating the marginalized as enemies, and talked about how that's been going on in the U.S. since the beginning, right? Genocide of indigenous folk, my folk, slavery, Jim Crow laws, police brutality, prison industrial complex, the separation of families, right? Separation of families and detention, right? The detention, the incarceration of children, right? Quote unquote immigrant children who, people might call them immigrant children, but I know who they really are. They're descendants of the Toltec, the Mexica Azteca, the Maya, right? Descendants of indigenous folk who are simply completing this sacred 4-directional migration, right, of the Hopi. I mean, the Toltec, the Mexica Maya, the Mexica Azteca, the Maya, were descendants ultimately of the Hopi, and there's a sacred migration that we hadn't completed, and so these folk, right, my grandparents, they came, just completed the migration. That's what they're doing, a sacred migration. But we call them immigrants, right? The U.S. calls them immigrants, and that they, even though we're back in our ancestral homeland, right? This is where we're from. We're called immigrants, and they separate. I mean, the atrocity of separating families and incarcerating children. Anyway, so number 4, that was number 2. The treatment of the marginalized leads to the end of empires. Number 3, plague. So think COVID-19, right? The U.S. is 4.25% of the global population, yet makes up 20% of global deaths due to COVID-19, right? An inflated number, right? Talking about inflation, but it's a real number. It shouldn't be that high, right? It's poor response by the empire is what it is. And part of that's probably, if we look at the money, probably because, the rich and powerful needed time to become more rich and powerful, right? But anyway, number 4, insurrection, right? We talked about Insurrection Day, January 6th, just happened recently, January 6th, 2011, right? The first armed insurrection in 200 years. So insurrection's another factor that leads to the end of empires. And the 5th factor that I'm talking about today is debasing the currency. So moving on. Let's talk a little bit more about inflation. Inflation is a tool empires use to fund wars. So what happens is, especially near the end of an empire, like what we're in right now in the U.S., is the rich, they really don't want to, and the powerful, they really don't want to continue to fund the empire. So they do all kinds of certain things, right, trickeries and whatnot, to stop paying taxes. And we talked about this last week, right? Amazon, 2 years, 0 taxes, the big Amazon, right? Outgoing or former President Donald Trump, right? $750 in taxes for 2 years, right? I mean, I pay way more than that. I mean, you know, these people who are at the center of the empire don't want to support the empire no more in taxation. So then the empire has to inflate the currency to pay for wars and other things, not just the wars, but other things. So we're going to I want to give an example of this. Hopefully this will drive the point home. For 600 years, 6 centuries, the Byzantine Empire had a gold coin called the Byzant, B-Y-Z-A-N-T. And it was remarkable because the Byzant actually retained its currency for those 600 years, for 6 centuries, and it kept inflation in check. It was, at the time, the most used currency in the world. But something happened. In 1071, so in 1071, the Byzantine Empire decided they're going to do what? Debase their currency, right? So they reduced the amount of gold in the currency, right? In that gold coin in the Byzant. Why did they do this? I mean, 600 years of success. Why would you throw it all away, right? Well, they did it to fund a war against the Turks. So how did all this work out for the Byzantine Empire? Not very well. They actually lost the war. They lost the war to the Turks. They lost their currency, right? They lost the currency ended up failing, right? People lost faith in the currency and it failed. And it ended up, the financial chaos and ruin ended up bringing down the empire. Just completely ended the empire. And there's other examples of this in history of empires ending because of the debasing of the currency. There's also other examples of hyperinflation, like in Germany in the early 1900s. But yeah, I think that one really drives the point home. So now I want to switch to ancient texts for a minute. There's an ancient text, and you've probably heard it before. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Here's how Beto would interpret this from a systems perspective, because people, preachers and whatnot, they use that ancient text really to drive home this idea that individuals shouldn't fall in love with the love of money and whatnot. And I'm not going to argue that point, but I'm going to say from a systems perspective, it is for the love of money, right? For the love of controlling and manipulating the money supply by the rich and powerful, that is the root of all kinds of evil. Do you understand what I'm saying? So instead of looking at it just in an individual perspective, let's look at it as a systems perspective, because there's people out there, right, these rich and powerful that are controlling the money supply. They love it. They love that manipulation. They love that control. And it truly is the root of all kinds of evil. Because like I said before, working folk lose ground, the poor become poorer, ultimately the currency fails, right? There's poverty and starvation everywhere. That's the end result of all of this. In 2009, the physician and former U.S. congressperson, Ron Paul, not Rand Paul, that's his son, Ron Paul, right? Ron Paul, who served his congressional district in Texas, there in D.C., really quite the economist, even though he's a trained physician, quite the economist. He self-studied economics. Anyway, he said this in his book, And the Fed, in 2009. There will be behind the scenes, right, in secret, the Fed and other elites planning a new system, international in scope and fiat in nature. What is he talking about? I mean, I read that. I read his book again to prepare for this show, and I'm like, what is he talking about? And I'm like, oh, it dawned on me. He's talking about when the money fails, right? going back to ancient text for a second, if you look at, there's an ancient text where it talks about the money failing in Egypt, right? And how they're hungry for bread. He's talking about the money failing here in the U.S. and what's going to happen next. So I bring this up because there's actually a TV series that was all about this. And it's I watched it on Netflix. I believe it's Netflix. It might have been Amazon Prime. I only get two. Amazon Prime, Netflix, and that subscription, temporary subscription to Hulu I was talking about. But anyway, Mr. Robot, a TV series that first aired on USA Network, talks all about this, about the U.S. currency failing. And, so anyway, Mr. Robot is starred in by Ramin Saeed Malik. Let me say that again. Ramin Saeed Malik. Ramin Saeed Malik was born in 1981 in LA County, USA, to Egyptian immigrant parents. So his ancestry is Egyptian, even though he was born here, right? He's from LA. He's an LA kid. At the 91st Academy Awards, Malik won the Best Actor Award for his portrayal of Freddie Mercury in the 2018 film Bohemian Rhapsody, if you've seen that, about the lead singer of Queen, Freddie Mercury. Did a fabulous job. Love that movie. Anyhow, so that, a lot of you might know him from that. But prior to that, he actually won the 2016 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series for Mr. Robot. What was Mr. Robot about? What was his role in Mr. Robot? So in Mr. Robot, Malik plays Elliot Alderson. Elliot Alderson is a cybersecurity engineer and a hacker. So like he works as a cybersecurity engineer during the day and at night on the weekends. He's a hacker. Elliot has an alter ego, and this alter ego is Mr. Robot, who in the TV series is played by Christian Slater. If you remember, Christian Slater is a very popular actor in the 80s and did a fabulous role in Mr. Robot. I mean, really good job. So anyhow, Mr. Robot is what they call an insurrectionary anarchist. And he leads a group of hacktivists. And these hacktivists are known as F Society. And what is F Society about? What's their goal? F Society's goal is to actually eliminate consumer debt. They want to get rid of consumer debt. They feel that if they can get rid of consumer debt, people's home mortgages are, wiped out. People's credit card debts are wiped out. People's student loans are wiped out. People's auto loans are wiped out. The working class will rise, right? So they want to get rid of consumer debt, and so they decide that by going after E Corp, which at the time, which is like the biggest, which is not like, it is the biggest conglomerate in the world, right? E Corp, also known as Evil Corp. That's what Elliot and Mr. Robot call them, Evil Corp. By hacking Evil Corp and encrypting their financial data, that they can wipe out consumer debt, and it's going to be a great thing, right? Debt's gone. People's, they're going to rise, right? It doesn't end up working out that way. It makes it worse for working folk. And ultimately, E Corp or Evil Corp ends up developing their own cryptocurrency. They issue their own cryptocurrency called the E-coin. And so this is what Ron Paul was prophesying back in 2009, that the corporations, right? Corporations would get together with the government and actually issue a different currency, international in scope, but fiat nature, still not backed by gold or silver or anything, right? Nothing intrinsic, no intrinsic value there. And so that's what happens in Mr. Robot. So we're going to go ahead and make a shift now. So we talked a lot about Hamilton, a lot about Mr. Robot, tied it all into banking system, central banking and whatnot, inflation. Now I want to shift to generational wealth. So every 3 years, the Federal Reserve does a survey. It's called the Survey of Consumer Finance, and they released one in 2019, so before the pandemic. And in this survey, it reports that the mean net worth of the bottom 25%, think about that, the bottom quartile, the bottom 25% of Americans is actually the mean net worth is actually negative $13,500. That's a whole lot of Americans, a full quarter, right? Mean net worth negative $13,500. This comes from the Federal Reserve, right? When I read this, it reminded me of of what the great teacher said, right? One of the great teacher's quotes. Great teacher said, "The poor you'll always have with you." So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about it in alignment with, the ancient wisdom that I've been taught, right? And I said, you know what? It's really the poor will always be with you while we are living in the fourth world, right? While we're living in the fourth world, because in the fifth world, we know that everything changes, right? And we're in that in-between time, right? Right now, between the fourth world and the fifth world. We know per Hopi Maya prophecy that we're going to, divisions and hypermaterialism are going to go away, right? There's going to be, we're in that in-between time of spiritual conflict, and we're going to end up getting along. All peoples are going to end up getting along and living in harmony with each other, nature, right? And poverty and all this nonsense is just going to go away, because everything's going to turn from man-made currency, which is what it is now, to spiritual currency, which then reminded me of that John Lennon song, right? Imagine. And I'm going to do a future episode and bring that to bear. But anyhow, imagine what the world's going to be like. It's going to be beautiful. But of course, those in power right now don't want that to happen. Why? Because they're spiritually bankrupt. Because they love the control and manipulation of money, right? They don't have the spiritual currency to make that shift to the fifth world, but we do. We do, right? So even though, a quarter of us, I don't know where I fit, but, I'm sure I'm not in the top half, but probably, I don't know. Anyway, a lot of us, right, our mean net worth is negative, right? Or maybe a little above negative, but it ain't a whole lot, right? It ain't a whole lot. But what we do have is spiritual currency, which is what's going to be important in the emerging world, right? The fifth world. And this is per ancient wisdom, Hopi Maya prophecy. And so I'm going to give an example of this now. So a couple episodes ago, I talked about how time is relative, right? What do I mean by that? Is time, this idea or this, reality a lot of folk are living in, that time only moves in one direction, that is not supported by science or by theology, right? Theology tells us that to the divine, a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years like a day. That means that time goes forward and backwards, right? And science says that too. Time is relative, right? Physical equations can be done both ways, right? It can go forwards and backwards. So this idea that time only moves in one direction going forward, that's not truth. It might be reality, but it's not truth. So I want to give an example of this and tie in generational wealth. So my father, on Thursday, I got a call from my mother. I'm from California, originally San Francisco, but I live here in Boston now, and I got a call from my mother on Thursday. And my mother says, son, I got some news. I said, what's going on? She said, your father, he had surgery scheduled for like an angiogram for his heart. They're going to take a look at his heart because he's been having some, discomfort and pain. And I know this because I've been talking to him for, about a week about this. And he said, so he scheduled a surgery for Friday. They're going to take a look at his heart, see what's going on, for Monday. So he came in, on Thursday we went to the hospital, talked to the doctor for pre-op, right? For the pre-op. And during the pre-op, he ended up going into cardiac arrest. He became unresponsive and stopped breathing for 2 minutes. Thankfully, he was right there with nurses and doctors who specialize in this thing, right, and this type of thing. And so they went to work right away, and they revived him. He was flatlined for 2 minutes, and then they revived him. They brought him back, and then they took him in, and tried to figure out what's going on. And they couldn't find any blood clots. And then the next day they did more tests, and they couldn't find anything. And so anyway, I talked to him, and you know, he's a tough guy, right? He's trying to play it off. Oh, it was just an episode. I'm like, and not just an episode. You were flatlined for 2 minutes. And I did ask him this. I said, did you see heaven? And he said, no, I really don't remember anything. And I asked him that because he had recently written a book, and it was like, it's on heaven and miracles. And my advice was to take the heaven part out and just focus on the miracles. And so I wanted to know, you know, if you flatlined for 2 minutes, did you see heaven? He didn't see heaven. So maybe my advice was actually pretty genius. Anyhow, you know, we're kind of talking about this and what happened. And I told him, I said, well, maybe at the end of the day, you know, our prayer worked. Because what happened is when my mom called me, we said a prayer, right? We went into scientific prayer mode, and which is available. If you all have a need, please reach out. We would love to offer up a scientific prayer for you. But so we did a scientific prayer, as we have done since I was a kid. And I said, you know, it sure seems like the scientific prayer worked. He said, yeah, it sure seems like a miracle because they couldn't find anything wrong with me. And he said, I actually feel better now than before I went in and you know, and had the episode he calls it. It wasn't an episode. But anyway, it was a true cardiac arrest. But I said, well, and I kind of joke, and I said, well, it appears that some of my immortality is rubbing off on you. I said, you got to watch more of my shows and read more of my posts. He's read a few and watched a couple of shows. I said, it appears that my immortality is rubbing off on you. And I joked about it with him, but there's part of it's serious. That what I'm saying here is this idea that generational wealth doesn't just move forward, right? When we think of generational wealth per the media and, you know, everything else that's out there in society, is that, you know, people save money and they give it to the next generation as an inheritance, right? But because we know time is relative and goes backwards and forwards, if my spiritual currency, right, fifth world spiritual currency, that can be inherited backwards. It doesn't just have to go forward to my sons, right, my children. It can actually go backwards to my parents, right? Because we know through science, right, that the negative effects of aging can be reversed, right? We're made of stardust, right? Our bodies regenerate themselves. So this whole idea that things only move in one direction, that's a false reality. That's not truth. So anyhow, I've talked a lot, and I'm going to go ahead and end here, but I'm very appreciative of you all. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak with you and to, you know, present this content. My heart is filled with joy, and I wish you a blessed rest of the day or night, wherever you are, because I know there's people watching from all over, from here all through the U.S., but also in Europe and in India and you know, everywhere. And so anyhow, I wish you a blessed rest of your day or night, wherever you are. I hope you can join next week again. I'm here every Sunday morning on Facebook Live, starting at 8:35 a.m. Pacific Standard Time and 11:35 Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to go ahead and shut down now, turn off, and again, blessings and security. Bye-bye.